When the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, Angron found himself on the human world of Nuceria, far from Terra, right on top of the Ice-Tooth Mountains where he was found. At the same spot, the slave trader who discovered the Primarch saw a scene of carnage. Around the Primarch lay numerous Xenos corpses. Imperial scientists later determined that they were Eldar, who had foreseen the great bloodshed that would result from the Primarch falling to the planet. It appears that they died in an attempt to stop him. Angron was enslaved. Later, as soon as he regained his health, he was taken to the capital of the planet Deshea, where he was forced to fight as a gladiator and proved to be an invincible warrior, becoming the main favorite of the bloody games. Like all other gladiators, Angron was implanted with special nerve implants that unusually increased his strength and aggressiveness, butcher's nails, cybernetic cortical implants. His so-called masters didn't know, or perhaps didn't care, confident in their unrivaled power and luxurious palaces, about the bitter hatred and resentment that burned in Angron's heart. His only friends were the gladiators with whom he fought. For a long time the Primarch had been planning rebellion and revenge, and soon shattered his chains by leading a bloody uprising set among the largest games of death that the arena of the city of Deshea had ever hosted. City after city fell before Angron and his loyal gladiators. This army soon became known as the Eaters of Cities. But though it was victorious time and time again, despite the superior long-range weaponry of the planet's rulers, Angron realized that his rebellion was ultimately doomed to failure. Exhausted by constant battle and starvation, Angron and his brothers were determined to stand up and die in honorable battle rather than surrender to the mercy of the victors. At this time, far away in orbit, the Emperor of Mankind had proudly watched Angron lead his rebellion, but now decided to intervene, unwilling to accept the death of his lost son in battle, no matter how determined and honorable the cause. After meeting with Angron and offering him a place beside the Emperor, he was refused. The Lord of Mankind disagreed with the Primarch's choice, and on the eve of the final assault forcibly teleported an enraged Angron to the flagship of the Dogs of War Legion, resulting in the slaughter of the rebellious slaves left without their leader, down to the last man and woman. Angron would never forgive the Emperor for this. It became a stain of guilt and shame, a wound smouldering in the depths of his soul that would soon be used by the warrior when he turned his brother against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. Upon taking control of the 12th Legion, the Blood Primarch embraced many changes. Knowing how successful his cortical implants could be in increasing a warrior's prowess in battle, Angron decided to insert implants, prototypes of the Butcher's Nails. Each Astartes Legion Eater of Worlds to increase aggression and raise the pain threshold far beyond what even the Legion's superhuman flesh with Astartes was capable of. However, this posed a difficulty. Angron's implants were relics of long-lost technology, little understood even by its creators, and removing them from Angron for scrutiny would prove fatal to the Primarch. The Legion's Marines and apothecaries attempted to duplicate the process, using the Primarch's own implants as templates for redesigning the devices. Early attempts to replicate these implants were far from successful and resulted in high mortality rates and insanity among the volunteers. However, over time, a viable form of cortical implant technology was replicated and steadily improved, although it was never completely stable. In those distant times, butcher's nails were considered virtues. None of the Astartes of the recently renamed Legion Eater of Worlds questioned their Primarch's decision, and when their lord demanded his sons lay down under the knives of their own Marines, few resisted the chance to share the same virtuous pain as their noble Primarch. Since the introduction of the butcher's nails, the Legion had changed. The World Eaters, once known for their brotherhood, became known primarily for their savagery. Reports of excessive Legion casualties in wars began to come in, and the Imperial army asked for help from other legions if the World Eaters responded to their call for help. The butcher's nails dulled all other pleasures. The adrenaline released from the stress of combat was the only way for the implant wearer to feel any emotion. The spoils began to eat away at the spirit of the 12th Legion as soon as they rescued their Primarch. However, the World Eaters could still refuse to receive the nails, But they chose to emulate their father, despite the cost. They chose to mutilate themselves, crack their skulls open, and allow the poison of the nails to be placed inside. Although Angron had ordered the nails to be implanted, even he could not force 100,000 warriors to bend to his will if they refused to mutilate their minds. Deep in their hearts, the legionaries of the 12th knew that Angron was broken long before they found him. That's why they let him drive the butcher's nails into their heads. They hoped that by breaking themselves on the same anvil, they would finally feel unity, a sense of kinship with their genetic father. But this weakness only bred corruption, and the World Eaters were finally cursed to spend eternity in carnage in the name of the Blood God. After the betrayal on Istvan III, the Legion of World Eaters, under the leadership of their savage Primarch, became even more withdrawn and out of control on the battlefield. Psychosurgery, heavily utilized by the Legion, became even more pervasive and extreme in its use. Lightning-fast infantry attacks, reinforced by fast-moving vehicles to immediately engage in bloody close combat with the enemy, had always been the hallmark of the Legion. And now they knew no other purpose. They were only interested in slaughter for the sake of slaughter, beyond any strategy. The World Eaters had quickly found a new master, the blood god Khorne, who demanded more victims and skulls. Under the influence of the warp, Angron became a mighty red monster with a huge rune sword. After arriving in the Eye of Terror, Angron gained possession of his own demonic world. But how might events have turned out if Angron hadn't initially fallen into slavery, where he was installed with the butcher's nails? How would events in the galaxy have unfolded further if the Emperor had found Angron before the slavers of Nuceria were able to corrupt the work of the Overlord of mankind? The most obvious changes concern the Primarch's personality and behavior. While Angron would likely remain one of the most aggressive and violent Primarchs, he would still have the ability to be motivated by more than simple lust for battle and hatred. Butcher's nails stimulate the warrior's adrenaline production, leading to greater aggression in battle. When the nails are activated, they inhibit the production of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the human brain to stimulate instinctual aggression. They also kill all other forms of emotional response and neuroelectrical activity in the brain, except for that which regulated the flow of adrenaline. Any attempt to remove the implants proved fatal, as the brain became completely dependent on the regulation of neurotransmitters by the nails. This feature was described by the 12th Legion in their research into the nature of nails. Of course, this knowledge meant little to those suffering from implants. The pain of the butcher's nails put the lust for killing above all other preferences. Without those implants, Angron could feel joy, sorrow, grief, pleasure, and the rest of the spectrum of emotions. Taking this into consideration, if Angron had reunited with his father before being enslaved, the Primarch simply would have had no reason to dislike and hate the Emperor. And since Angron's relationship with the Emperor would not have been so negative, it is quite possible that the Primarch would have stayed on the loyalist side during the Horus heresy. Besides, Angron would never have become a demon prince. After all, the ritual of Lorgar that elevated the Primarch to demonhood was performed in order to keep Angron alive. Thus the World Eaters would not have appeared on Istvan III when the traitors were purging their ranks of those who remained loyal to Emperor Astartes. Consequently, this purge would have ended much faster. After all, the events on Istvan III had dragged on for such a long time, in large part because Angron had personally led his legion to the planet, wanting to slaughter every loyalist with his own hands. Thus, there would have been nothing to stop Horus from repeating the orbital bombardment, which in turn would have resulted in the death of Lunar Wolf's captain, and he would never have become one of the travelling knights of Malkador. Among other things, had Angron not been enslaved on Nuceria, the wars of the 12th Legion would never have heard the singing of the butcher's nails, which would have undoubtedly affected the Legion's traditions and battle doctrine, keeping the notion of discipline alive within its ranks. However, the dogs of war would still remain aggressive and warlike enough to stand out from the rest. According to the text of the book, Horus's Heresy Betrayal, the warhounds of the 12th, even before their reunion with the Primarch, were characterized by a stronger thirst for battle relative to the other legions. However, while some have questioned these facts, believing that the records were deliberately distorted to fit the actual image of the legion, the record of the Dogs of War is quite conclusive that the legion was specifically designed to be an aggressive and brutal strike force. Thus it can be assumed that the Primarch's gene code is not entirely responsible for the Legionnaires' behavior. After all, even before reunification, the Dogs of War were characterized by an unhealthy thirst for blood, and promotion by winning a duel over a senior officer was the norm. And the Butcher's nails only elevated the already existing features of the 12th to an absolute. It's also safe to say that if the Emperor had found Angron before his enslavement, the Legion would never have adopted the name World Eaters. After all, the name came from an army of rebellious slavers led by the Primarch, dubbed by the Lords of Nuceria the Eaters of Cities, and Captain's words only confirm that.
Primarch, Overlord, let your former wars be devourers of cities, but under your leadership we shall become devourers of worlds.
And since we can't say what name the Legion would have adopted if Angron hadn't been enslaved on Nuceria, we'll take it for granted that the Legion will keep its old name. Well, if Angron, along with the 12th Legion, had remained loyal to the Emperor, according to the above facts, what effect would that have had on the course of the Siege of Terra? We can say with relative certainty that there is no way the Dogs of War would have made it to the solar system in time. For various reasons in real history, only the White Scars, Blood Angels, Imperial Fists and Space Wolves made it to Terra in time to reinforce its defences. In addition, the Space Wolves had time to leave the planet and attempt to kill Horus before he reached the solar system. However, without the World Eaters in their ranks, the traitors would have had much more trouble storming the walls of the Imperial Palace, and as a result, the traitors would have suffered much more impressive losses. Thus, it is safe to say that the assault on the walls would have dragged on for much longer, especially considering that the legionnaires of the Emperor's children had left the battle on their own, having gone to terrorize the civilian population. That might well have given the Loyalists the time they needed to pull all the reinforcements to Terra. Further, the story could have developed in two ways. Either Angron would lead his legion to attack the traitors alone, or he would join Russ in his mission. In the former case, the Dogs of War, most likely like the Space Wolves, would have retreated, suffering heavy losses. But if Angron and Russ had attacked at the same time, it is possible that Horus would not have survived the operation. Despite the fact that Horus was already stronger than any of the Primarchs at that point, in real history, Russ managed to inflict a very serious wound on the warrior using the Emperor's spear. And if Horus had met not one but two of his brothers at once, among other things recognized as one of the best fighters among the entire 20, it is quite possible that this battle would have been the last for the warrior. And in that case, the Emperor would not have been placed on the Golden Throne. After all, Horus was the only one who had a chance to defeat the Lord of Mankind.
Be like a chilled blade that has just undergone tempering, cold and hard on the outside, but red from the forging heat burning invisibly within.
Ferrus Manus, also known as Gorgon, Primarch of the Iron Hands, 10th Legion of Astartes. He was known for his unrivaled blacksmithing skills, which allowed him to create unique weapons, some of which he gifted to his Primarch brothers. As a token of his respect for Horus, he gave his brother, who was declared a warrior, a unique power sword, which Horus used until his fall. After the timely assistance of the word-bearers in a time of need to the Iron Hands in one of the battles of the Great Crusade, the grateful Horus produced the Illuminarium power mace for Lorgar. Recognizing his brother's skill, Ferrus gave Vulcan, who shared the art of creating various weapons, a unique plasma pistol, which Vulcan took with him to the battle on Istvan V. Ferrus's most expensive gift and finest work was the flaming sword he gave to his closest brother, Fulgrim. The Primarch of the Iron Hands Legion was a legend among the people of his homeworld of Medusa, who called him Gorgon, one of the oldest mythical beasts. Theros was one of the strongest of the Primarchs, and within him blazed the heat of a furnace whose fury was tempered by a will as cold and unyielding as iron. Gorgon was known for his uncompromising nature and his unwillingness to show favor to his closest followers, and even to Primarchs. He wanted to see power everywhere, from which he deprived the inhabitants of Medusa of many of the benefits of civilization so that they would breed the strongest offspring for his legion. The demand for physical superiority extended not only to the body and mind, but also to the tools of war. And so Gorgon was a master smith that could only be matched by Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamander Legion. It is said that Ferrus Manus felt peace only by labouring at the anvil and creating a marvel of blacksmithing skill beyond the reach of even the Lords of Mars. The Gorgon was blessed with a physiology remarkable even for a Primarch, for his hands were covered in the liquid metal that legends say remained on him after his battle against the greatest of beasts before his reunion with the Emperor. Ferrus's armour was as heavy and strong as the armour of an extra-heavy tank, but he always left his arms open to harness their full power. Over the decades, Ferrus forged countless unique weapons, some of which he gave to his Primarch brothers and some of which he kept for himself. Gorgon himself favoured the heaviest battle hammers, maces and other weapons that only the Primarch himself could lift. Thousands of planets would be conquered with ruthless iron hands under Ferrus's leadership. Every weakness in mankind would be destroyed so that it would become stronger. That was the goal of the Primarch of the 10th Legion. It is said that entire worlds suddenly began to behave peacefully and try to improve their society, just by hearing of the approach of the Iron Hands. During the Great Crusade, the Iron Hands, along with the Emperor's children, fought the Diasphorex. That campaign was a reflection of the strong bonds of friendship between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim, Primarch of the Legion of the Emperor's Children. During the conquest of the planet 1544, the Elder sent Ferrus a vision of his death at the hands of Fulgrim. But Gorgon, who never trusted the Xenos, did not believe the prophecy. Ferrus was one of the 4 Primarchs whom Rabut Gilliman called the Fearless Ones. One of the 4 brothers who best reflected their father's intent, and whose legions had their best qualities. The other 3 were Rogaldorn, Sanguinius, and Lemon Russ. After Fulgrim sided with the warrior during the Horus heresy, he met with Ferrus Manus and tried to induce him to join the rebellion. Gorgon was so enraged by such an offer that he attacked Fulgrim. In a short battle, Ferrus destroyed Fulgrim's flaming sword, the very weapon he had given his brother many years before. However, Fulgrim was able to render Ferrus unconscious and fled, taking the huge thunderbolt of the Forges, which was Fulgrim's return gift to Ferrus. The Iron Hands were one of the Emperor's loyal legions summoned to Istvan V. Since Ferrus Manus and his legion were very far from that planet at the time, Gorgon took only the fastest of the legion's ships and his best warriors with him. During the battle on Istvan V, Fulgrim personally killed Ferrus by beheading him with a demonic weapon. Afterward, Fulgrim became nearly insane with grief and was immediately taken over by the demon dwelling inside the cursed blade. Most of the veterans of Ferrus also died in battle, caught between the hammer of the children of the Emperor and the anvil of the 4 legions of the second wave, who also turned out to be traitors. Fulgrim, possessed by a demon, gave Ferrus's head to Horus. Later, as the heresy flared and Horus became more and more influenced by the chaos, he secured Ferrus's skull on his throne and occasionally spoke to him. During these monologues, Horus complained that there were only bloody tyrants, maniacs and demons under his command, but no strategists or men of duty like Ferrus. However, rumour has it that even though the Primarch of the 10th Legion was beheaded by his brother, he is still alive in one way or another. After the massacre in the landing zone on Istvan V, many of the fighters of the defeated legions of the Iron Hands, Raven Guard and Salamanders were certain that their Primarchs had fallen in battle. However, within the 10th Legion, a so-called Gorgon cult had formed, consisting of several Iron Fathers. They claimed that Ferrus Manus was able to survive the duel with his brother, and that they were directly enforcing the Primarch's will. Despite the fact that Captain Shadrach Medicine of the 10th Clan Company and Primarch Salamander Vulcan condemned the cult's activities and considered the mere fact that the Gorgon had survived to be impossible. However, The fact that the Iron Fathers were indeed receiving orders could not be left unchecked, and Primarch Salamander decided to personally look into the situation. However, when he finally found the mysterious cloaked figure with the metal arm, it turned out to be nothing more than a golem made of dead flesh and mechanical parts. His hammer, Udracule, rose from its place and flew into the Primarch's palm with a metallic clang as if drawn by a powerful magnetic field. The two Iron Hands warriors guarding the weapon were unable to prevent him. Vulcan grabbed the hammer, lunged forward, and ripped the robe off the Gorgon, exposing the lie lurking beneath. A skeleton was revealed, completely mechanical, made of polished steel, devoid of limbs, and even with an eyeless skull. It was as tall as Ferrus, but no more resemblance, save for a silver hand, an authentic one, raised on the battlefield. Devoid of support, secured by brace and bolts, it hung limply from the wire, twitching its fingers haphazardly. Upon seeing this, Vulcan became enraged and destroyed the idol created by the Iron Fathers, including the original hand of Gorgon, so that no one could ever again defile his brother's memory with such cowardice. However, while Ferrus Manus most certainly did not survive his duel with Fulgrim, the possibility remains that he may be resurrected with the help of one of the keys of Hell. These keys are nothing more than artifacts from the Dark Age of technology, devices from the distant past found back on the Primarch's home planet and safely hidden by Ferrus Manus himself. The very existence of the keys of Hell is a secret to all but the commanders of the Iron Oaks, and even the Order's closest allies, the Adeptus Mechanicus, are unaware of the legacy hidden on Medusa. And one of the keys has already been used many times by the Iron Hands to bring back to life the most valuable warriors for the Order in the guise of a cybernetic revenant. The most famous example is Lord Creus, who fell in battle against the traitors of the Death Guard.
I track the sensations as the body becomes mine again. It has changed. The currents seem weaker, the tingling of flesh farther away. The cold vibrations of metal press against my consciousness where before there was a warm shiver of nerves and muscles. I've lost a lot, but I don't feel weakened. I feel stronger.
Thus, if enough fragments of the Primarch's body were preserved, he could be recovered by this method. However, when one considers the ferocity with which the traitors had stripped Manus's body for a trophy on Istvan V, it was unlikely that the Iron Hands would ever be able to gather enough material. After all, the only thing they were able to preserve was just one of his metal arms. However, it's also worth remembering that Roboute Guilliman returned their Primarch's skull to the 10th Legion. Admittedly, how he was able to take it from Horus is still unknown. Be that as it may, there is another way to bring Ferrus Manus back to life: cloning. After the massacre on Istvan V, Fabius Bile, senior apothecary of the Legion of the Emperor's Children, cloned the fallen Primarch several times at Fulgrim's behest. His brother's refusal to join him in the rebellion organized by Horus was quite a painful blow to the Phoenician, resulting in him subsequently trying to sway at least his clone to his side. However, each of Fabius Bile's copies became enraged at the mere mention of betrayal, and Fulgrim had to destroy them time and again before finally surrendering. However, even though the Phoenician had given up hope of luring the 10th to his side, Fabius Bile did not stop his work on the Primarch clones altogether. Subsequently, having cloned not only Ferrus but others as well on numerous occasions. For example, he was able to create perfect clones of Horus and Fulgrim himself. And while most of these clones have now been destroyed, it is conceivable that if the Iron Hands were to obtain the remains or a living clone of Ferrus Manus, they could use one of their keys of Hell to bring their father back to life. However, even in this case there are certain difficulties. For example, it is highly doubtful that all members of the Order would calmly accept such a return of their Primarch. For example, Sergeant Taurus considered cybernetic revenants a real ugliness that has no right to exist, which is clearly evident from the words he said to Lord Curia.
Destruction would be your forgiveness. I will not sacrifice the power of my clan to erase what you have done. Your existence is in itself a punishment for heresy, and I will not spare you from it.
And given the number of Astartes who believe their Primarch survived the duel with Fulgrim, it is likely that such a resurrection would cause a rift within the Order, and a war between those who believe the return of the Primarch in any form is a good thing, and those who believe it is ugly and heresy. But could Ferrus Manus return in any other way? Well, according to the text from the Index Astartes.
The moment the Emperor fell, the wave of psychic power he released reached Ferrus, even though he had long since left the world of the living. The Primarch's spirit appeared before his legion, and his pain and despair could not be conveyed in words. He spoke of the great darkness and terror that awaited mankind in the future, and promised that in the darkest hour he would be among his warriors to guide them through all the trials that the universe would unleash upon their heads.
This suggests that Ferrus Manus may one day return as a warp entity. This is partially supported by the text of the book Lord of Mankind, where the Emperor summoned the souls of those killed on Istvan V, including Gorgon, to assist in the battle against Draconian, and the 10th led this dead host.
A giant among giants. His huge arms were ready to descend upon any foe. The 10th son of a dying empire, reborn for a brief moment by the devastating fury of his father.
Thus, one might well assume that the Primarch would come to the aid of his sons when they needed him most, like Sanguinor, who is the blood angel in the most hopeless of situations. However, this outburst of rage could have been nothing more than a mere embodiment of the Emperor's psychic power, which for one reason or another took the form of a Gorgon. But be that as it may, if the 10th did return, whether clone, cyborg or warp entity, the enemies of humanity would surely fall before his might. Vulcan, an irresistible warrior whose strength in battle was tempered by profound wisdom. Vulcan was the lord and embodiment of the entire Salamander Legion. He was as furious as any of his brothers, but he recognized the destruction and the power and responsibility that he and his legion carried. In all his endeavors, Vulcan had always sought to limit unnecessary and senseless destruction, seeing it as a road to destruction and the desolation of the soul. He has uncomplainingly taken on any hardship that has befallen him or his sons, while learning the wisdom gained through adversity to become an even better protector for the growing Imperium. But like a subterranean fire in the Primarch slumbered an inexhaustible source of indomitable anger that could burst forth in the hour of need, as ruthless and all-consuming as the flames of the troubled world Vulcan called home. The 18th stood out for his physical strength and stature, even among his brothers. Even Horus could only match him in height when clad in Terminator armor. Unlike his brothers, Vulcan placed an unexpectedly high value on ordinary human life and was often willing to risk his own to save others. When the Horus heresy broke out, the Salamanders, along with the Iron Hands and the Raven Guard, were trapped on Istvan V, and Vulcan found himself captured by Konrad Curze. For months, the Night Haunter tried unsuccessfully to dispose of him. Vulcan was torn apart, his throat ripped out and his head cut off. He was even thrown out into outer space and put under the nozzles of a spaceship. But it was all to no avail. Like all of the Emperor's sons, he had his own specialty. The Primarch of the 18th Legion was immortal. Realizing that there was no way he could kill Vulcan, Konrad Curze attempted to drive him insane. Several psychers led the prisoner through a series of visions in which he had to complete a crucial mission and invariably failed, causing many deaths. But Vulcan's mind proved to be as indestructible as his body. In the end, Night Haunter offered Vulcan his freedom if he defeated him in a duel. To do so, he had to find his Warhammer, the Bearing Dawn, in the center of a labyrinth built by Perturabo. It was thought impossible to find the way through this labyrinth, for its corridors violated the laws of physics. But Vulcan managed and challenged his maddened brother to a duel. Unable to resist Vulcan, Konrad Curze eventually fell, defeated by the hammer. Defeated, Curze asked Vulcan to kill him. The 18th, however, would not honor Curze's request, as he felt that by doing so he would lower himself to his level. Instead, Vulcan decided to leave Curze alone with his own anger and escape his captivity. A personal teleporter was hidden in his hammer, which teleported the Primarch of Salamanders to the Ultramarines, their home planet. For 3,000 years after Horus's heresy, Vulcan led his order, but then he disappeared, leaving the Salamanders with the task of finding the 9 artifacts he had hidden throughout the galaxy. So the Primarch decided to test his sons. The salamanders believe that when all 9 artifacts are found, their Primarch will return. By the end of the 41st millennium, only 5 had been found. Vulcan was last seen during the Beast War when, led by the Primarch, Imperial forces launched a massive invasion of Ullanor to finally kill the Orc, who showed his strategic cunning by luring the invaders into urban battle zones and avoiding direct confrontations. The Great Beast intended to hold the Imperials on Ullanor long enough until the refitted attack planet could teleport to Terra, using the attack moon still in its orbit, and destroy the throne world once and for all. However, Vulcan managed to lead a force of space marines directly into the palace in his capital city of Gorkograd and stand against the Orc. Under Vulcan's orders, Lord Commander Kurland evacuated his forces from the temple and allowed the Primarch to fight the beast directly. During their duel, the Great Beast showed that he spoke Imperial Gothic perfectly, gloating that humanity was on its knees and he would be the end of it. Vulcan wrapped his arms around Warboss and they fell into the energy generator of the Temple of Gargoth, where the Primarch was exposed to the immense energy forces of the War. But instead of being consumed by the energy as would have happened to so many others, Vulcan used his primal and savage nature to become one with it and strike the final blow. He blew up the generator, setting off a chain reaction that destroyed the Gargantuan temple and seemed to destroy them both. However, while the beast, eventually though seriously injured, survived, the Primarch was considered lost forever from that moment on. But what really became of Vulcan? Could he have survived that duel with Orcs? Surviving such an explosion seems unlikely, but if the beast could, why couldn't the Primarch? Especially since the 18th has a distinctive feature that sets it apart even from its brethren, the Eternal Vulcan. Eternals are a very rare subspecies of humanity who are immortal for some unknown reason. Not only are they timeless, but they're also able to be reborn after a violent death. And during the Horus Heresy, Vulcan demonstrated the Eternal's ability on numerous occasions, being reborn after being fatally shot in the head, after being torn to pieces, and even after hitting the surface of Macragge after falling from orbit. The only way to destroy an Eternal is by using a special mineral, which can restrain the regeneration of Eternals. This was the method used by Cabal agent John Grammaticus, who mortally wounded Vulcan during his duel with Conrad Curse on Macragge. However, the Vulcan was able to revive once more after a few weeks. This time, however, it was only because the 18th was still needed by the Emperor. Well, if Vulcan still retained his eternal abilities at the time of the war with the Beast, then there was no doubt that he could survive Gargant's explosion and be ready to return to the aid of the humans the moment they needed him most. However, despite his apparent ability to endure wounds that would immediately kill anyone else, Vulcan's eternity remains a moot point. The ability to revive depends on many factors. For example, in Nick Kame's book Old Earth, Vulcan, upon returning to Terra, was only cured of his wounds after connecting the Seven Hammers talisman to the Golden Throne. This talisman was capable of storing Psyker energy and releasing it in a huge destructive wave that would destroy all of Terra along with the traitors if Horus won. Also, evidence of Vulcan's immortality can be found in David Annandale's book The Hunt for Vulcan, where Caldera's soldiers witnessed the incredible resilience of the Primarch more than once.
He never died. We've all seen it. He always comes back, always shows up somewhere else. After all, he took the Greenhorns away from us.
While such events are more than capable of pointing to the nature of the Eternal, it may well be assumed that Vulcan's impressive regeneration abilities are nothing more than manifestations of the Emperor's incredible power that he has previously demonstrated such strength. In the Lost Liberation, the Overlord of Mankind similarly distinguished the wounds Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, received on Istvan V. In addition, even the fact that Vulcan had demonstrated incredible resilience long before meeting the Emperor was not 100% proof of his eternity. The ability to survive what would kill anyone else, be they mere humans or Astartes, is commonplace for Primarchs. For example, in Traitor Blood for the Blood God, the World Eater's Primarch, Angron not only survived being stepped on by a Hound-class Titan, but was able to hold back 410 tons of wrath with only his hands. Even Lord Commander, who had fought alongside Vulcan during the Beast War, was well aware of who was fighting on their side, and was not surprised by the many reports attesting to the Primarchs' inhuman resilience.
Each of them witnessed this and many other moments that should have meant death to anyone exposed to the concept at all.
In addition, the fact that in all cases where Vulcan was pronounced dead, no one had ever seen his body or what was left of it made such claims questionable, to say the least, since it was so easy to mistake witnessing a devastating missile strike that raised a huge cloud of smoke and dust, and take for granted that no one, including the Primarch himself, could have survived it. However, it should not be forgotten that the Emperor himself recognized the fact that the Vulcan had experienced true death. The Lord of Mankind personally told this to his son in the book Old Earth, when he explained to the Primarch the full significance of the Seven Hammers talisman created by the Vulcan.
That's why it has to be you. It's always been in you, and I hoped the day when I would need it would never come. And I hoped for a lot of things. Your death, your true death and rebirth gave you what you needed to create the talisman. All your pain, all the suffering of your legion, it all brought us.
If resurrection from the dead can bring forth the eternal, as happened to John Grammaticus, can the reverse process occur? Is it possible to strip immortality from someone born with this feature, like Ollanius Pius or Vulcan himself? Well, depriving an eternal of the ability to be reborn is quite possible. A similar thing happened in Forgotten Empire, where John Grammaticus wounded Vulcan with fulgurite, a powerful artifact, but died in the process. Upon returning to life, Agent Kabbalah discovered that his next death would be his final one. Furthermore, if we remember that fulgurite can permanently destroy an eternal, and Vulcan is said by the Emperor to have experienced true death, we can assume that the 18th who returned to life at the will of the Lord of Mankind, despite being completely cured of his wounds, now exists as an ordinary mortal, having lost the abilities of an eternal. If this is the case, then the death of the Vulcan on Ullanor during the War of the Beast can safely be called final. However, we should not forget that we are talking about a Primarch, and if an orc could survive a gargantuan explosion, why couldn't Vulcan? However, left alone on a planet filled with orcs, having survived one of the hardest fights of his life, and likely suffering from serious wounds, it was unlikely that even the Primarch would be able to hold out much longer. And most likely, even if Vulcan did survive that explosion, it's unlikely that the orcs would have left him any chance of getting off the planet. It can be fairly safe to assume that the Vulcan is dead. Conclusively, Gargant's explosion, even if it didn't kill the beast, likely did an excellent job of ensuring that Salamander's dreams of being reunited with his Primarch would forever remain mere dreams.
I am Alfarius, that's a lie.
Of all the Emperor's genetic sons, the twin Primarchs Alfarius and Omegon are without a doubt the most mysterious. Their entire history is surrounded by secrets, legends, contradictions, and deliberate falsifications. It is known that Alfarius was the last of the found Primarchs and reunited with his legion at the end of the Great Crusade, which did not allow the 20th to gather forces comparable to the Legion brothers. The power of the Alpha Legion, however, was not in orbital volleys or crushing tank attacks. There were no greater specialists in reconnaissance and sabotage in the entire galaxy than those of the wars of the 20th. During the Horus Heresy, the Alpha Legion supported the rebel warrior, following their only known targets, resulting in the deaths of both Primarch legions. Alfarius fell at the hand of Rogel Dawn in Pluto's orbit, while Omegon, who had taken command of the Legion, found his death in a duel with Robut Gilliman, falling from a single blow to the Primarch of the Ultramarines. However, Omegon's death, unlike that of Alfarius, is considered controversial, both because of the transience of the Primarch's duel, and because the Alpha Legion seemed to attach no significance to the loss of their Primarch, continuing to act as an organized force, clearly continuing to receive orders. However, this story of the death of the Primarchs is nothing but a skillful falsification, dating back to the time when the flames of the Great Crusade were still flaring. As we learned in the novel Alfarius, the Head of the Hydra, The capsule containing the Primarch of the 20th Legion remained on Terra. Alpharius was not the last Primarch to be found. On the contrary, he was the first. However, unlike his brothers, he did not have the glory of a warlord awaiting him. Instead, Alpharius, along with his legion, dissolved into the armies of the Imperium, defending the interests of the Great Crusade from the shadows. The talents of the 20th allowed him to infiltrate even the ranks of the legions led by his newly found brothers. Furthermore, Omegon's existence had long been a mystery, even to Alpharius himself, and always remained so to everyone else. The Primarch had found his twin brother during the Battle of Bar Saver. Omegon was less fortunate than Alpharius, his pod ending up on a dead planet where he was the only sentient being. And if it hadn't been for a random scavenger ship, he may never have been able to get off it. The brothers recognized each other immediately, and the first joint decision they made was to choose the Primarch, that he would find one of them as the last brother. The novel ends with the all-too-familiar scene of the Primarch sneaking aboard the Vengeful Spirit and breaking into the Strategium to meet with the Primarch Horus. The first Astartes raises a bolt pistol, loses an arm. I plunge the spearhead into the chest of another, throw it at the third. Then I duck and spin the pale lance over my head, blowing the heads off the fourth and the one-armed first. The third one lies in front of me and tries to get up. I place the tip of my weapon at the base of his neck. "Stop!" Horus barks, spreading his arms. I raise my spear slightly, mimicking a man in confusion who sees his opponent turn to him instead of attacking. To be honest, I was actually a bit stunned as Horus approached me. My twin had told me of Lupercal's flow of charisma, the flame of his spirit, but I wasn't truly prepared for it. He is a being of power and purpose. In that moment I realized why wars follow him so joyfully, why enemies flee, and why the defeated consider themselves liberated. "At last my last brother has been found," Horus announces, and tears of joy glisten in his eyes. "Drop your weapons, brother. You are among friends. You are with your family. Who are you?" I asked, and my voice sounded unsure despite everything, and it wasn't just an act. "I am Horus, known to my warriors as Lupercal." Horus replies, "I am Primarch of the Lunar Wolves and first son of the Emperor, Lord of Mankind. I am your brother." He shakes his head slightly, as if unable to believe what he has witnessed. "What is your name?" he asks. I raise my hands and take off my schlepp. As I look into Horus's eyes, the slight sighs on the bridge tell me that the similarities in our features have been noticed. I am an Alpharius. It was a lie. As the text of the book suggests, the one who was known during the Horus heresy as Alpharius was actually Omegon, and it was he who eventually fell at the hand of Dawn. But what became of Alpharius himself, unless he was actually killed by the Primarch of the Ultramarines? Well, there is ample evidence of Alpharius appearing already after the Horus heresy, particularly in the Danivra subsector. Ravaging off the adamantium-rich moon warband of the Alpha Legion was led by a Chaos Lord calling himself Alpharius. The Council of High Lords, however, was divided as to whether the traitor was the real Alpharius. However, the head officer of the Assassinorum prepared an operation to eliminate the Lord of Chaos. Over the course of several years, 6 Vindicare Temple snipers identify and kill a dozen Alpha Legion champions whose breastplates bear the name Alpharius. However, reports of attacks on the mines of the subsector only increase in frequency. 5 years later, the frozen heads of all 6 Vindicars are found in a food warehouse for the High Lords. Considering how dangerous operatives are to Officer Assassinorum, even the fallen Astartes, and the fact that each of them has been discovered and destroyed, it is likely that this Alpharius was no ordinary Chaos Lord. Furthermore, this particular Alpharius has the skills and experience to stealthily sneak into the Emperor's palace and leave the heads of the assassins there. However, there is no evidence to confirm or deny the identity of this Lord. After all, Legion fighters have spent their entire history impersonating their Primarch, and it is entirely possible that this Lord of Chaos is merely a phenomenally competent saboteur and not one of the twin Primarchs at all. Many of the Alpha Legion fighters believe that at least one of the Primarchs is still alive. Rob Sanders' book, Sons of Hydra, featured a character named Lord Dominatus, to whom many Alpha Legion warbands were subordinate. The warbands of the 20th Legion sought out Lord Dominatus, and together with the word-bearers, they travelled to the regal Belphegor, a planet deep in the core of the galaxy. It had once been one of the central worlds of the ancient Necrontyr race, and was now under the control of several Alpha Legion warbands. When the commander of the 20th Alpha Legion finally met Lord Dominatus, he immediately mistook him for the Primarch, due to his completely identical appearance and unnatural grandeur. The Lord's very presence was overwhelming, exactly as it is when meeting Primarchs. Commander addressed the Lord, urging him to return to his sons and unite the Legion. Take back the Legion, pull it out of the darkness, give those who have lost their way a purpose, unite us, lead us, Lord Primarch. However, contrary to Commander's hopes, Lord Dominatus turned out not to be the Primarch of the 20th Legion, but an entity spawned by the Khitan Mephitran, better known as the Deceiver.
This creature is not your galactic prince. What stands before you is not a Primarch, but a creature that freely crosses the void of space. It feeds on the stars, plunging the firmament into the blackest abyss. It lives by deception, lies are to it as heir to you, transcendent, eternal, vampiric. It is a ghostly reflection of blinding doom in a broken mirror.
However, while the above champions either definitely were not or are not necessarily the Primarch, the possibility that he is still alive remains very high. For example, there is a theory that Alpharius was hiding under the guise of Janus, the first supreme Grandmaster of the Grey Knights. However, in the book The Last Son of Prospero, the identity of Janus was revealed. He turned out to be Revuel Arvida, one of the remaining loyalists of the 15th Legion. However, given the secrets shrouding the Alpha Legion, there will always be someone in the galaxy who declares himself to be an Alpharius. Besides, both Primarchs may indeed be dead. However, Omegon or Alpharius's duel with Guilliman alone is filled with inconsistencies. For example, during the battle, the Primarchs were described as towering demigods above the Space Marines, while it is known that Alpharius and Omegon were almost no different in stature from regular Astartes.
There are no fair ways in the battle against Xenos and traitors.
Of all the Emperor's creations, his own sons, his Primarchs, were undoubtedly the greatest weapons with which men carried their will to the stars in the flames of the Great Crusade. It seemed that nothing could thwart the plans of the Overlord of mankind and stop the victorious march across the galaxy. But history, as we know, has a very peculiar and often cruel sense of humour. The main hope of mankind turned out to be his worst nightmare. The Emperor's 8 proud sons turned their weapons against their father and brothers, unleashing the most massive war in human history. During this war and the events that followed, the surviving and remaining loyal to Terra Primarchs were forced to abandon the Imperium, leaving power in the hands of the High Lords. However, many in the Imperium believe that in the hour of greatest need, they will once again stand at the forefront of humanity's army and lead them to victory. In the 41st millennium, these hopes began to be realized with the return of the 13th Legion's Primarch, Roboute Guilliman. Despite the fears of many, the Lord of Ultramar did not escalate the situation by reshaping the Imperium according to 10,000 years of forgotten imperial truths, standing at the head of an army and a new crusade. However, there are others besides the 13th whose return could turn events down the most unpredictable path. And it is quite possible that one of Guilliman's loyal brothers will soon face his legion once again. Of course, the Blood Angels and Iron Hands can hardly hope for the return of their fathers. Primarch Sanguinius was killed by Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit just before his fateful duel with the Emperor, and Ferrus Manus was beheaded by Fulgrim during the Battle of Istvan V. However, others still look to the future with hope.
Doubt is the greatest weakness. It can break down the strongest wall with a single shot and bring down the mightiest champion before he draws his sword.
Although the Primarch of the Imperial Fists is officially presumed dead, the circumstances of his death are too heavily shrouded in controversy and innuendo to state this with 100% certainty. It is generally believed that Dawn fell in battle against the forces of Chaos in the year 781 of the 31st millennium, when confronting a large Chaos fleet during the First Black Crusade. The Chaos fleet, commanded by the returning Abaddon the Destroyer, vastly outnumbered the Imperial forces. Aware of the enemy's superiority, Dawn used hit-and-run tactics in an attempt to outmaneuver the Chaosite advance on Imperial worlds. Dawn and 3 clans of Imperial Fists conducted a series of masterful boardings, disabling the engines and life support systems of several warships, and even capturing gun batteries and turning them against other Chaos ships. Eventually, however, the enemy cornered Dawn and his warriors as he launched his final attack on the bridge of the fleet's flagship, the Disruptor-class battleship, the Sword of Sacrilege. No one returned from that attack. The Order's chief librarian later found his Primarch's body on the bridge, in a blood-chilling parody of Dawn finding the wounded Emperor on the vengeful Spirit, and carried it away from there before the shattered flagship escaped back into the hellish depths of the Eye of Terror. According to another version, the librarian only managed to find the severed left hand of the Primarch, on which, as everyone knows, the names of every new master of the Order of Imperial Fists for the past 10,000 years have been carved. There is no further information as to the fate of the body of the probably deceased Primarch. Not even a hint, though it is accurately stated that Dawn died in the service of the Imperium. Of course, if Seven is indeed dead, it would be foolish to expect his return, at least until forces capable of bringing the Primarch back from the beyond intervene in events. But be that as it may, the return of Dawn, while a significant event, would hardly be a real shock to the galaxy and the Imperium. Still, let's not forget that the Primarch of the Imperial Fists has been in service longer than the other brothers and has personally overseen the transformation of the Imperium into what it has become by the 42nd millennium.
We hunt because we are hunters. There's no point in saying, there it is, it's over. You've accomplished what you set out to do. The world around you is constantly in motion. You move with it or you'll be swept away.
The fate of Jagatai Khan is also shrouded in mystery, much like the fate of Seven. All that is known reliably is that he disappeared into the web while pursuing the Dark Elder who were attacking his homeworld of Chogoris. However, given that over 10,000 years have passed since his disappearance, and as we know Kamara has not been razed to the ground in that time, it is logical to assume that the Primarch is either dead or in captivity. Be that as it may, there are no credible reports of the Fifth's death, so the White Scars can still count on the return of their father. However, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. After all, the White Scars, while they undoubtedly have their fans, it's still hard to call them the most popular legion. Besides, it's hard to even imagine what major events its return could entail. Still, despite their danger, the Dark Eldar are not one of the main threats to the Imperium, nor for that matter to anyone else in the galaxy.
The first axiom of victory. Be where the enemy doesn't want you to be. The first axiom of stealth. Be not where the enemy expects to see you. The first axiom of freedom. Justice without strength is weakness. Strength without justice is a tyrant.
As for the Primarch of the Raven Guard, his story, though not spelled out with the exact year, is still very well known. After the Horus Heresy, the 19th dedicated himself to finding and destroying traitors, becoming the nemesis of Lorgar himself. For 10,000 years now, he has travelled the Eye of Terror, becoming the epitome of fear and inevitability among traitors. And perhaps he is one of the main reasons for the long isolation of the Primarch of the Word-Bearers. However, 10,000 years of being inside the warp storm could not help but affect even the Primarch. Corax has long since ceased to be the one who once led his legion to victories in the Great Crusade. In his place, the 19th has long since lost his human form, and may already belong more to the immaterium than to the real world. Whether he can return to his sons and walk among them as he once did is impossible to say, or, like Celestina or Sanguinor, he is now a creature of the immaterium, born of loyalty for the Great One of mankind and hatred for traitors. Whatever the case, his return is likely to be tied to Lorgar's return. After all, it's unlikely that Corax, after 10,000 years, would suddenly decide to just let his brother go. However, given all the recent events, it is quite possible that soon the word-bearers will finally be distracted from building endless temples, and their Primarch will decide that it is time for action, which makes the 19th a likely candidate for return, even if not as one of the Imperium's warlords, but as an active force.
Our job is to protect and preserve humanity.
The one person we should not expect to see anytime soon is Vulcan. Although he has appeared in times of need, coming to the aid of his sons, he has not appeared since his death during the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium. Of course, we should not forget that the 18th is eternal and therefore cannot die definitively. However, even despite this, we should not count on his imminent return. As we know, before his disappearance, Vulcan gave his sons the task of finding 9 artifacts that he had hidden throughout the galaxy. The Salamanders believe that when all 9 artifacts are found, their Primarch will return, even if we take it for granted that the hopes of the sons of Vulcan will be realized. It's worth remembering that so far they've only found 5 artifacts out of the 9 needed, and it's unlikely that they can expect to find 4 more artifacts anytime soon. Among all the Space Marines chapters, there are hardly those who believe in the return of their Primarch as firmly as the Space Wolves. Despite the lack of any news or assignments from their father, they believe that when the hour of great need arrives, Russ will return to his sons. However, the reality may prove to be quite cruel for both the Wolves and their Primarch. Like Corax, Leman Russ has also set out to fight around the horror. However, unlike the 19th, he did not become Magnus's personal nemesis. At least nothing is known about that. What is known, however, is that even the 13th Company, lost in the warp, knows nothing about the fate of their Primarch, known to have wolves finding parts of his armor in various corners of the galaxy over the course of 10,000 years. Putting aside the rather wild assumption that Russ is fighting the demons of the Wolves of Terror, there are only 2 options left. The Primarch is either dead or, like Corax, has lost his human form, either by turning into a wolfin or by becoming a warp spawn. It should not be forgotten that Russ did not return to his sons either during Magnus's attack on Fenris or after the fall of Cardia, which also makes one think of either the Primarch's death or his perceptions of part of the Great Need. However, the return of Russ is exactly what could literally turn the universe upside down. The Primarch's fiery temper, absolute loyalty to his father and imperial truths, and strained relationship with Guilliman, and rejection of the Codex Astartes, coupled with a complete lack of understanding of the principles of diplomacy, could lead to very tangible results, up to and including an open confrontation with Guilliman's forces. What the Imperium has become in 10,000 years is capable of enraging Russ, and the already difficult relationship between the Order of Space Wolves and the Inquisition could only worsen. Of course, the Wolves can hardly be expected to build their own small and proper Imperium, no matter how ironic such an outcome might be. But a massacre in front of the gates of eternity, in an attempt to break through to the throne room, is quite in the spirit of Russ. We don't yet know what Cole has implanted in the minds of the Primaries Space Marines. Who knows what directives he placed in their minds while his training machines processed their brains during their long sleep. The very story you refer to proves better than anything that even those infinitely loyal to the Emperor can be led to a sad end through manipulation and deception. The Dark Angels may not be as certain of their Primarch's return as the Space Wolves, but their hopes are far more realistic than those of their brethren. Unlike the missing Russ and Khan and the lost human form of Corax, Leo L. Johnson has been sleeping safe and sound for 10,000 years, in the bowels of what remains of Caliban, right in the heart of the Dark Angel's fortress, the famous Rock. Aside from the fact that the former is obviously alive and not in a state any closer to a spawn of chaos than the Emperor's creation, there are far more prerequisites for his return than the other Primarchs. The unprecedented activity of the Fallen and Luther's own flight, as well as Cypher's close proximity to Terra, may well serve as preparation for such a grand event as the return of the next Primarch. Furthermore, like Russ, the awakening of the former could also have very significant consequences. It should not be forgotten that despite the division of the Legion of Dark Angels into orders, they are still a unified force, as they carry a common secret, and the masters of the subsidiary orders still continue to report to the leadership of the Dark Angels. This means that upon awakening, Leo L. Johnson will be more than capable of reassembling a unified legion under his command, which could cause the former's confrontation with Guilliman. However, it could also be the basis for their successful collaboration. Given the Primarch's military talents and the mobility of the Rock, Leo L. Johnson could take the place of the Regent on the other side of the Great Rift, or become the shield of the Imperium in the upcoming war with Tyranids or Orcs. Be that as it may, it is the Primarch of the First Legion who seems to us the most likely candidate to return. During the isolation of Old Earth in the Age of Discord, the Emperor spent years planning and preparing the creation of the Imperium, preparing to reclaim the galaxy long before conquering Terra. He conceived and created 20 Primarchs, future instruments of change and gods of war. These unique individuals, the perfect work of genetic mastery and knowledge beyond the comprehension of all but the Emperor himself, were destined to become his generals and conduits of his will, great leaders who would conquer millions of worlds in his name. Each Primarch would be endowed with powers and skills far beyond any other man, and abilities rivaling only the Emperor himself, and no two would be alike. Each will embody one of the facets of warfare and the art of warlordism, and will choose it for himself. Together with the Emperor, having gathered the legions under his command, they will become a force unprecedented and unrivaled among all things. However, the Emperor's ambitious plans are apparently frustrated by a catastrophic event, the true nature and scope of which will remain a mystery. Some unknown force stole the Primarch embryos from the Emperor's care and scattered them across the galaxy. However, despite this loss, the flames of the Great Crusade were unstoppable. 20 legions of Astartes, superhuman warriors that would bring the galaxy to its knees, were created from the surviving samples of the Primarch's gene seed. As the campaign progressed, one by one the Primarchs returned to the Imperium and took charge of their legions. However, 2 of them were not destined to share the glory of their brothers. Even before the Horus Heresy began, the 2 Primarchs, the 2nd and 11th, along with their legions, were erased from Imperial history. There was nothing left of them, no names, no merit, not even a mention of the crimes they had committed, if indeed they had been guilty of anything. Mentions of them had been erased from everywhere. Even the Primarch brothers could remember nothing of the 2nd and 11th, except the fact of their existence. However, over time, some traces of the lost legions did begin to surface. In particular, the existence of the 11th Legion had long since become a confirmed fact. But what exactly happened to the lost Primarch and his legion? Throughout Imperial history, it has been repeatedly mentioned that the Space Wolves were involved in the fall of the 11th Legion. Part of the reason for these rumours was due to the Primarch of the 6th Legion himself, Leman Russ, who often refers to himself as the executioner of the Emperor. But be that as it may, these rumours may well be based on solid facts. As described in Hour of the Wolf, the warriors of Legio Custodes clearly know something about the fate of the forgotten Primarchs. In particular, we are interested in a conversation between 2 Custodes, Cassius Vaishalen and Maldovar Colquan, from which it follows that Custodes, together with Leman Russ, clearly had a hand in the disappearance of the 11th Legion. Domains. If Guilliman rebels against the Emperor, the Space Wolves will become his greatest enemies. What happened 10,000 years ago to the 11th Legion only confirms that. Why would Guilliman arm a threat to his own ambitions? Interestingly enough, in the same conversation, Maldovar hints that the 11th Legion's removal from history was the result of some unforgivable acts committed by the Space Marines, and that they hardly committed these crimes of their own free will, being rather victims of deception.
We don't yet know what Cole has implanted in the minds of the Primaris Space Marines. Who knows what directives he placed in their minds, while his training machines processed their brains during their long sleep. The very story you refer to proves better than anything that even those infinitely loyal to the Emperor can be led to a sad end
There's also circumstantial evidence that the Legion of the Word-Bearers was also involved in the fall of the 11th, as can be gleaned from the novel The First Heretic, when the Galvorbak Wars travelled to the Eye of Terror. The distorted space of the Immaterium allowed them to find themselves not just in the past, but in the heart of the Emperor's genetic laboratories, just before a sudden warp storm was to take out the Primarchs. Upon seeing the capsule with the 11th, the Word-Bearer Wars noted that they should have destroyed it right here and now, which would have avoided a very embarrassing story and saved a great deal of time. Of course, all of the above are not 100% facts, but the manner and circumstances in which these words were spoken clearly hints to us that Legio Custodes, along with the 6th and 17th Legions, were in some way involved in the downfall of the 11th. Of course, the exact details of the 11th Legion's crimes still remain unsolved, but it can already be inferred that the Legion, having fallen victim to someone else's manipulations, committed treason. Be that as it may, in the short story The Rest at the End of Memory, Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, recalled the fate of the Lost Legions, and noted that if they were still here at the time of the Horus Heresy, the Loyalists would have lost this war long ago. This suggested that at least one of those legions, if not both, were capable of treachery unless they had already committed it.
Through manipulation and deception, what happened could have cast a shadow over everything. Dorn knew that now. The bleeding and hateful truth is clear to me. If they were with us now, we would have already lost this war.
However, many argue that the misdeeds of the Lost Legions are far worse than simple treason. This is indicated by the fact that records of those legions that sided with the warrior during the Horus Heresy still exist, though their treachery is not even to be doubted. To be fair, however, information about those legions is classified to such an extent that it could well be compared to erasure from history. No one will ever tell an ordinary imperial citizen that as many as 9 legions of Astartes betrayed the Emperor's light. Only the highest ranks of the Imperium, like the honoured Inquisitors or Lords of Terror, have access to such information. For ordinary Imperials, there are only 9 loyal Primarchs that have been canonized as saints by the Ecclesiarchy. However, in the same story, Rest at the End of Memory, it is almost directly stated that the Marines of the 2nd and 11th Legions were distributed among the Imperial Fists and Ultramarines after the memory-wiping procedure, since, according to Malcador, the Astartes legions are too valuable a resource to be destroyed so easily. However, the question of whether these Space Marines retained their gene seed, or whether their gene seed were removed and replaced by the legion that now corresponds to them, if that is even possible, remains open. However, while this account roughly explains what happened to the Marines of the 11th Legion, the fate of the Primarch himself remains unknown, but the fact that Leman Russ referred to himself as the Emperor's executioner, and the fact that the Space Wolves are definitely involved in this story, suggests that the 11th was killed by the Wolf King. But as logical as this thought may seem, it must be remembered that at the time of Russ's duel with Magnus on Prospero, Russ doubted that the Primarch could be killed at all. The outcome of the duel only reinforced these doubts, as the Red Cyclops was able to not only survive the duel, albeit by a stretch, but also save the remnants of his legion. Such thoughts were unlikely for someone who had already had the experience of killing a Primarch. It is entirely possible that the 11th Primarch was not killed for his crimes at all. Instead, he may have been imprisoned in a place unknown to anyone. According to the 9th edition of the Codex Adeptus Custodes, the underground vaults beneath the Emperor's palace contain something known as Object 11, the very designation of which is quite suggestive. While the fact that the lost Primarchs are being held in the Catacombs of Terror is itself unlikely, there is some evidence that does support it. For example, while preparing the Imperial Palace of Cassade by Rogel Dawn, prior to Horus's arrival on Terra, workers discovered hidden cameras underground that were labelled with the numbers 2 and 11. Upon discovering them, the workers accidentally activated several traps of an obviously psycho nature that could both protect the chambers from outside intrusion and prevent something from breaking through from the inside. After speaking with Malcador and learning the truth about his lost brothers, Dawn ordered the found cameras to be reburied. And it is possible that the custodians secretly moved the 11 Primarchs into their vaults during the palace siege, due to the risk of damaging the cameras during the fighting. Even if this is the case, it is not necessarily the case that the imprisoned Primarch was still alive when doing so. It is quite possible that the Object 11 designation also refers to the Primarch's body, which itself could be dangerous, as it is the source of unique gene material. After all, Dawn himself, when giving the order to bury the chambers he found, called them tombs. Although the Primarch may well have used the word metaphorically. It is also worth remembering the throne of Malcador, decorated with 2 skulls marked with the numbers 2 and 11, which also suggests quite specific thoughts. However, these skulls are equally likely to belong both to the lost Primarchs and to be simply symbolic decorations, the essence of which is clear only to Malcador himself. After all, even Object the 11th of May will have nothing to do with the forgotten Primarch, and the stages of significance may be just a coincidence. But if this is indeed that Primarch, and furthermore if he is still alive, the question arises as to what Robuta Guilliman, the only currently active Loyalist Primarch, would do if he learned of his existence. Would it be a happy reunion? Or would the Primarch of the 13th Legion leave his brother to rot where he is? At the end of the 33rd millennium, a war broke out in the depths of Segmentum Pacificus that was recorded by Imperial chroniclers as the War of the False Primarch. The details of this conflict are unknown, as most of the records were deleted by order of the High Lords of Terror. What we do know, however, is that this war lasted longer than the Horus Heresy and the War of the Beast combined, raging for 80 standard Terran years, until the High Lords of Terror were able to put an end to it by sending 5 orders of Astartes into the slaughter, each with their own ferocity and brutality. The Carcharodons, Death Eagles, Tomb Guardians, Flesh Eaters and Red Talons were tasked with destroying the 11 orders of their brothers that had been declared traitors. Subsequently, the renegade orders were not just destroyed, they were completely erased from all Imperial records, and the planets on which their fortress monasteries were located were sentenced to exterminatus. But despite the fact that the details of this war were either classified or erased, we know that it was started at the fault of a certain false Primarch. But who was this false Primarch? It is generally believed that this man was a space marine, most likely a master of one of the renegade orders, who for some reason proclaimed himself Primarch. Most likely this man was mad with megalomania to such an extent that if he did not consider himself a true Primarch, he was sure that he was worthy to stand in line with the sons of the Emperor. As a result, an entire order turned its back on Imperial truths and declared its separation from the Imperium. This is considered the most likely cause of the False Primarch's war, as cases of separatism and similar lunacy among the Astartes have already occurred many times in the history of the Imperium. One such case is the Archeo Rebellion, when, as a result of the radical Inquisitor's manipulation of the forces of chaos, one of Sanguinius' sons, named Archeo, was tricked into transforming in the image of his father. Archeo completely copied the Primarch's appearance, including his white wings. Eventually, however, the mutations got out of control, and Archeo was killed by his older enemy named Ruffin. But what if the false Primarch didn't just think himself worthy of a place in the ranks of the Emperor's sons? What if he truly believed himself to be the Primarch? For example, because of the gene seed. We know for a fact that in some of the Order of Astartes, mutations of the movie series can cause not only physiological abnormalities, but also abnormalities of a psychological nature. Some of these abnormalities may be considered minor, like the baldness and albinism of the Order of the Ghost's Death. Others can result in the loss of certain marine abilities, like the lack of Belcher's gland in Imperial fists, which prevents them from producing acidic saliva. The third leads to extensive mutations like bone spikes and growths in the marines of the Order of the Black Dragons or the Black Rage of the Blood Angels, when the sons of Sanguinius go insane and see themselves as their Primarch fighting their final duel with arch-predator Horus. Thus, we already have one example of a gene seed abnormality causing a Space Marine to think of himself as a Primarch, and it's not just the Blood Angels who are susceptible to this. A similar defect, though not as pronounced as Dark Fury, is seen in the chapter of Excoriators. Symptoms include loss of motor function, blank stares, trembling, weakened limbs, and a nightmare in the waking hours. A sense of Dawn's boundless despair at finding the maimed Emperor on Horus's barge. This defect is unique to the Excoriators, and no other order formed from the Imperial Fists suffers from anything like it. Thus one might think that the so-called false Primarch is really a master of the Order, maddened by a unique defect in his gene seed that caused him to believe he was the genetic father of his soldiers. However, tracing the real Primarch from whom the perpetrator of that war was descended is not possible, thanks to those Order Astartes, who took care of the complete disappearance of the renegade orders. Another, much less likely assumption about the identity of the false Primarch allows for the fact that the perpetrator of the 80-year conflict was indeed a Primarch. By that time, every Primarch had already been cloned, and most of the clones, if not all of them, were created by Fabius Bile, a senior apothecary of the Legion of the Emperor's Children. During the Horus Heresy, Fabius raised several clones of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, on Fulgrim's orders. The Primarch of the Children of the Emperor wanted to use them to pander to his ego by inducing his longtime friend to take part in the rebellion of Horus on their side. However, all of the clones remained loyal to the Emperor, causing Fulgrim to kill every successful clone created by Bile. After a couple centuries, it was revealed that the Clone Lord did not limit himself to this, creating many copies of other Primarchs, the most successful of which were the clones of Horus and Fulgrim. The Horus clone was killed by Abaddon using his original's weapon, the Horus Claw, while the Fulgrim clone was able to not only survive but grow into a full-fledged copy of the Primarch and later become Fabius's gift to Necron Overlord Trazyn the Infinite, in exchange for samples of the pure gene seed of the Emperor's children. But if Fulgrim's clone was more than viable, what would prevent Fabius from repeating his experiment? Among other things, Primarchs are known for their overwhelming presence effect. Each of the Emperor's sons seemed to spread a certain aura of majesty around them, making ordinary people instinctively want to bow down to the Primarch and serve under him. The false Primarch demonstrated similar things. And if the perpetrator of that war was indeed a clone of one of the Emperor's true sons, then one of the Loyalists, Ferrus Manus, Leo L. Johnson, Jagatai Khan, Rogel Dawn, Vulcan, Rabuta Gilliman, Corvus Corax, Sanguinius or Leman Russ, as most of Imperial society, whether civilians, Imperial Guard fighters or even some Inquisitors, are only aware of the existence of the loyal Primarchs, not even aware of the 11 remaining ones. This is explicitly pointed out in Chris Wright's book, Watchers of the Throne, where Inquisitor Erasmus Crowell saw a picture of all 20 Primarchs for the first time in his life.
It was covered with the same carvings as the Gates of Eternity. On the wall were carved images of stylized beasts and legendary heroes. 20 mighty knights ringed around the imperious figure of the Emperor on the throne. Some of these knights resembled the Ministerium-approved images of the Holy Primarchs. But why are there 20 of them?
However, even though the Imperials would have some difficulty identifying and accepting the false Primarch if he were a clone of one of the traitor Primarchs, one should not completely discount the possibility. And assuming that some of Fabius Bile's creations were able to survive the wrath of the Black Legion, and remembering that 2 of the Emperor's 20 sons are one of the major mysteries of the Imperium and their ultimate fate is still unknown, the assumption that the false Primarch belongs to the Emperor's 20 true sons does not seem so improbable. On top of this, it is commonly believed that the 2 lost Primarchs were removed from all Imperial records after their destruction by Leman Russ, also known as the Emperor's Executioner. However, we know that if the 2nd and 11th are indeed dead, they certainly did not die at the hands of the Great Wolf. This conclusion can be drawn from reading a book by the same Chris Wright called The Wolf King. For a long time, Russ, aware of his own strength, had doubted that the Primarch could be truly wounded, let alone killed. Now he knew that both were possible, as he had personally done both things. If he closed his eyes, he could still see the genuine horror in Magnus's one eye, seconds before the roaring warp hurricane had ripped the broken body to shreds. This is also supported by the audio drama Butcher's Nails, according to which Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, had no idea that the Emperor's sons could die. However, this in turn could also mean that Lorgar was simply unaware of the fate of the 2nd and 11th brothers. Thus, it is quite possible to assume that the Forgotten Ones were indeed executed, even if it was not by the hands of Russ. But what if the 2nd and 11th simply left Imperial space, even if their unknown crimes were the cause? And what if one of them decided to return to Imperium in the 33rd millennium, knowing nothing of the events of the Horus heresy? He would find a perverted likeness of his father's creation, a stagnant and drowning state in religious obscurantism, whose founder and lord is doomed to eternal agony in a state between life and death. During his journey through Imperial space, he could well take under his command many orders of Astartes that would gladly follow the new demigod, a living creation of the Emperor, and in the end, all of this could very well lead to a war against the Imperium, or more specifically against the High Lords of Terra. And if the perpetrator of the war in Segmentum Pacificus is indeed one of the lost Primarchs, it would explain many of the oddities associated with the war, such as the abnormally high number of Astartes renegades and the 80-year duration of the conflict. After all, at the time of the 33rd millennium, there was no one in the entire Imperium who could stand up to a Primarch on equal footing. It would also explain why all mention of this war has been erased from all Imperial records. The history of the Imperium, like any other nation, is full of inaccuracies. Some things have been forgotten during the millennia of the Golden Throne's rule, and much has been deliberately distorted. The average Imperial citizen often knows only what he or she has been taught according to the Inquisition and Ecclesiarchy-approved curriculum, and many, such as the inhabitants of wild worlds like Fenris, do not know even that. The mere mention of the names of the traitor Primarchs would raise very distinctive questions from the few who are aware of the darker aspects of Imperial history. Not to mention more specific knowledge like the destruction of the Thunder Warriors after the unification of Terra. And amidst all the abundance of forbidden knowledge, there are two names that have been forgotten since the dawn of the Imperium, when Horus had not yet become an arch-traitor and the humans were leading the victorious Great Crusade across the galaxy. Nothing is known about the Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions, neither their names nor their deeds. Even the names of their legions have been erased from all possible sources. 10,000 years later, it is no longer possible to know what caused such a punishment for the sons of the Emperor himself. As, however, it is almost impossible to meet a person who would have known that the Primarchs were originally not 9, but 20. However, whatever the fate of the 2nd and 11th, it is certain that they were once full members of the Imperial host and led their legions to the stars on par with their brothers. To completely remove just 2 men from history, even if they were Primarchs, seems more than possible. However, what became of their legions? Where could thousands of Space Marines have disappeared without a trace? And is the gene seed of the Forgotten Primarchs still alive? Well, based on the words of Malcador Sigillite, we can conclude that the Marines of the 2nd and 11th Legions did not share the fate of their Primarchs, being too valuable to the interests of the Great Crusade. According to the available evidence, instead of being destroyed, these Astartes underwent a memory wipe and were integrated into other legions, notably the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, as partially confirmed by a quote from Malcador himself.
The loss of the 2nd and 11th was a grievous wound to us and threatened the ideals underlying the Great Crusade. It would have destroyed everything we had built in an effort to reunite humanity and drive out our enemies. Something had to be done. The legionnaires they left behind bereft of leaders and abandoned, were too valuable a resource to give up. They did not share the fate of their fathers. You and Robut took their side, but you don't remember it. It was my lot to watch them adapt to their new circumstances. I granted them mercy, a second chance.
Well, if the Space Marines who had lost their fathers were given to the 7th and 13th Legions, then only one question remained. What became of the legacy of the forgotten Primarchs and their gene seed? Ever since the creation of the Astartes, there have been stocks of samples of genetic material from all 20 legions that are still stored on Terra today. The gene seeds of the 9 loyal legions are still used to create new orders of the Astartes, while the samples pertaining to traitors, according to the Ultramarine Codex 2nd edition, were placed in stasis as soon as the treachery became known. As for the gene seeds of the lost Primarchs, given that all mention of them had been erased from both the records and the memories of even the Primarchs themselves, it could be assumed that the stock of their gene seeds had been dealt with in the same way. Besides, according to rumours, the Marines of the 2nd and 11th often showed some form of instability, expressed in mental deviations and mutations, which also suggests the destruction of their gene seed reserves. However, despite all of the above, the fact that the stockpile was destroyed is highly unlikely. According to the novel series Dark Imperium, Belisarius Cawl, the creator of Project Primaris, had samples of gene seeds of all 20 legions, including the traitors and the forgotten. In addition, he not only had them directly available, but also experimented with them, finding that the samples of the 2nd and 11th demonstrated absolute purity and stability. In addition, Archmagos has proposed experimental implantation and observation of pre-existing unused gene seeds in experimental subjects, specifically the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 8th, 11th, 12th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th and 20th regions. None of them show any signs of degradation or tendency to undesirable tendencies in the subjects. All is well, Lord, Archmagos Belisarius Cawl assures you. He is so pleased that I have been instructed to repeat the request that these genetic lines be put into full-scale production and allowed to serve the Imperium as the Emperor intended. However, it is conceivable that Belisarius Cawl was mistaken in his conclusions or misinformed, as it is known that the Marines of the 15th and 20th Legions suffered from flaws in their gene seed. For example, the 15th Legion of the Thousand Suns suffered from uncontrollable and often fatal mutations, and this curse became so ingrained in the Legion's gene seed that even the Emperor himself could do nothing about it. And it later caused the ritual of the rubric Ahriman, which turned the entire Legion into golems of ashes encased in their power armor. The 20th Legion, according to Chapter 4 of the Index Astartes, also suffered from spontaneous mutations, though to a lesser extent than the Thousand Suns. However, the Alpha Legionnaires, in their own fashion, were able to channel these mutations to benefit the Legion's cause. Thus, there always remains the possibility that the 2nd and 11th stockpiles of gene seed were destroyed or placed in stasis. Be that as it may, there is still genetic material left that the Marines of the 2nd and 11th carried. One of the most important stages of becoming Astartes is the implantation of gene seed. Special implants whose sole purpose is to collect the genetic material of the remaining organs and form the basis for the creation of new implants. And given the intricacies of the process of integrating Marines into the new legions, it is quite possible to assume that the gene seeds of the 2nd and 11th still serve as the basis for the creation of new Marines in the order of Ultramarines and Imperial Fists. However, this assumption is shattered by one fact. The Emperor has personally made sure that no trace of the 2nd and 11th remains in the history of the Imperium. Not only their names and deeds, but everything in general, including the statues and murals adorning the Imperial Palace, were erased. Even the Primarch brothers could not pronounce their names. In the story, The Last Council, Horus tried to utter the name of one of the Forgotten Brothers in the presence of Malcador, and Sigillite, by sheer force of will, stopped the Primarch twice, nearly killing him. Thus, it is unlikely that the Emperors and Malcador would have been allowed to use the gene seeds of the 2nd and 11th for any purpose. Most likely the gene seeds were removed during Marine's integration into the new legions, which should have prevented their further use. Such a thing is not at all unprecedented. In the book Pandorax, a dark angel accepted into the ranks of the Grey Knights had his old gene seed removed and new ones implanted in their place, created from the gene seed of the Emperor himself.
Epimedes picked his arms and legs up under him. It had been 10,000 years since he had landed on the ground by jumping out of a moving vehicle. He had been doing this even before he had taken new vows and oaths, and his gene seed had been replaced with the biological material of the Emperor himself. But his memory didn't fail him this time either.
The possibility of extracting gene seed is also confirmed by the first chapter of the Index Astartes, according to the text, according to which the removal of genetic material is a standard procedure carried out not only with killed Astartes, but with all those whose implants have matured to the required state. For the gland located in the neck, the maturation period is about 5 years, for the one in the chest, about 10. In addition, we should not forget that during the Great Crusade, the Imperium was able to create new genetic material for the Astartes, if not faster, then certainly on a much larger scale than in the 41st millennium, since the laboratories of the Selenite gene cults on the Moon had not yet been destroyed. Thus, it is likely that the 2nd and 11th Primarchs were stripped of absolutely all of their heritage, including the gene seeds of their legions. What do you think? Remember, in every battle, for every hero, there are thousands who die in oblivion and obscurity.